The amber glow of Murphy's bar cast harsh shadows across weathered faces, but none harsher than the sneers aimed at Caleb Reed. Motor oil blackened his fingernails, engine grease stained his flannel shirt, the scent of diesel fuel clung to him like a second skin. At the mahogany table near the window, 3 men in charcoal suits raised their crystal tumblers in mock salute. "Look who crawled out from under another broken-down car," the tallest one drawled, his Rolex catching the dim light. "Single dad mechanic. Bet his little girl's having cereal for dinner again." Their laughter rippled through the smoky air, sharp and cutting. Caleb's calloused fingers tightened around his beer bottle until his knuckles went bone white. His phone vibrated against the worn leather of his wallet. Harper, always Harper, waiting at home. The businessman with silver temples leaned forward, voice dripping with silk-wrapped venom. "What's a grease monkey like you even doing in a place like this?" But what these predators in their $1,000 suits were about to discover would obliterate every cruel assumption they'd crafted about the man they'd just destroyed. Caleb's thumb traced the edge of his phone screen. Harper's message glowed in the dim light. "Dad, when are you coming home? I finished my calculus homework." Calculus. At 10 years old. The irony wasn't lost on him. His daughter solved equations that would stump most adults, while he sat here being dismissed as nothing more than grease under fingernails. The suits continued their performance, voices growing louder with each sip of premium whiskey. "Probably can't even help his kid with basic math," one of them chuckled. The sound scraped against Caleb's spine like fingernails on chalkboard. He stood slowly, deliberately, left a $20 tip on the scarred wooden table, more than his beer cost, more than he should spend. The bartender, a weathered man named Murphy, who'd known Caleb since childhood, caught his eye and nodded. Outside, the Oregon rain drummed against the windows like impatient fingers. Caleb pulled his jacket collar up against the autumn chill and walked into the night, their laughter following him like smoke. But as he reached his battered Ford pickup, a sleek black Bentley pulled into the parking space beside him. The driver's door opened with the whisper of expensive engineering. A woman emerged, her movements precise and controlled. Navy blazer, charcoal slacks. Hair pulled back in a way that suggested boardrooms and bottom lines. She studied Caleb with eyes that missed nothing, cataloguing details like a scientist examining a specimen. Her gaze lingered on his hands, on the way he moved, on something she seemed to recognize but couldn't quite place. The rain beaded on her umbrella as she approached the bar entrance. For a moment, their eyes met. Hers held a question. His held wariness born of too many nights like this one. The next morning arrived with the mechanical symphony Caleb knew by heart. Pneumatic tools hissed, engines rumbled to life. The smell of motor oil and possibility filled Reed's auto repair like incense in a cathedral. This garage was his inheritance, his burden, his sanctuary. His father had built it with his own hands in 1973, back when a man's word meant something, and craftsmanship mattered more than profit margins. Now it felt like a museum piece in a world that had moved on without him. The rent notice on his desk screamed numbers he couldn't ignore. $4,500, starting next month. The gentrification of Cedar Falls was pushing out everything authentic, everything real. Harper sat at the small desk in the corner, her school books spread around her like battle plans. Advanced mathematics textbooks that cost more than some people's monthly groceries. She worked with the focused intensity of someone who understood that education was the ladder out of their circumstances. Her pencil moved across the paper in confident strokes, solving problems that would challenge college freshmen. "Dad," she said without looking up, "Mrs. Patterson asked if you could look at her car this afternoon. She said it's making a funny noise." Mrs. Patterson was 83 and lived on Social Security. Caleb would fix her car for free, like always. It's what his father would have done. It's what Harper expected him to do. The Honda Civic on the lift had seen better decades. Its owner, a college student named Amy, worked 2 jobs to pay tuition. She couldn't afford the dealership's estimate of $800 for transmission work. Caleb could fix it for parts and labor, maybe $300 if he sourced used components. He lost money on jobs like this, but sleep came easier when he knew he'd helped someone stay mobile, stay independent. The transmission case told its story in metal and wear patterns. Years of deferred maintenance, of choosing between car repairs and textbooks, between reliability and rent money. Stories Caleb understood in his bones. The sound of expensive footsteps on concrete interrupted his diagnosis. He looked up to see the woman from the parking lot standing in his doorway. In daylight, she looked even more out of place among the auto parts and oil stains. Her presence filled the space with an energy that made the air itself feel different, more charged, more dangerous. "I need help with my car," she said. Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to getting what she wanted. Caleb wiped his hands on a shop rag, already calculating whether he could afford to turn away business, regardless of how uncomfortable it made him feel. "What kind of car?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew. She gestured toward the Bentley parked outside, its midnight paint job gleaming despite the overcast sky. The vehicle looked like it cost more than his garage's annual revenue, maybe more than his house was worth. When he approached the luxury sedan, his trained eye automatically assessed its lines, its engineering, its purpose. This wasn't transportation. This was a statement, a declaration of power and position that spoke in a language most people couldn't afford to learn. But something about the way she watched him examine the car suggested this wasn't a typical repair call. "The engine won't start," she explained, though her tone suggested there might be more to the story. "I've been stranded here overnight." Caleb popped the hood and immediately spotted the issue. Dead battery. Simple fix. But as his hands moved through the diagnostic process, he noticed things that didn't add up. The battery terminals were corroded in a way that suggested deliberate neglect, the kind of neglect that happened when someone wanted an excuse to visit a particular garage. His suspicion prickled along his spine like static electricity before a storm. This woman hadn't stumbled into his shop by accident. "Battery's shot," he said, keeping his voice neutral. "Need a replacement." She nodded as if this was expected news. While he worked, she wandered around the garage with the casual interest of someone conducting reconnaissance. Her eyes lingered on Harper's textbooks, on the certificates of achievement hanging crookedly on the wall, on the photograph of Caleb and his late wife Rebecca, taken the day Harper was born. The attention felt invasive, like fingers rifling through drawers he'd never given permission to open. Yet when she asked about Harper, her interest seemed genuine rather than predatory. "Bright child," she observed, nodding toward the advanced mathematics sprawled across the desk. 10 years old and working calculus problems. That's unusual." Caleb's protective instincts flared, but Harper looked up from her homework with curious eyes. "I like numbers," Harper said simply. "They make sense. They follow rules. Dad taught me that if you understand the patterns, you can solve almost anything." The woman's expression shifted subtly, as if Harper had said something more significant than either of them realized. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions and carefully guarded secrets. When the repair was complete, she handed him a check for twice his quoted price. The paper felt expensive between his fingers, crisp and substantial in a way that suggested serious money behind the ink. "That's too much," Caleb protested, but she was already walking back to her car. "Quality work deserves quality compensation," she replied, without turning around. As the Bentley disappeared down Main Street, Caleb found himself studying the check more carefully. The name in elegant script read, "Isabelle Morrison. Morrison Development. The company that was buying up half of Cedar Falls and turning it into something unrecognizable. Something profitable but soulless. That evening, as Harper tackled homework that would challenge most high school students, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that his world was shifting beneath him like sand. The woman's visit felt like the first tremor before an earthquake. Her questions had been too specific, too probing, her interest in Harper too keen. And that check, generous beyond reason, felt less like payment and more like an investment. But in what? The laptop on his kitchen table displayed search results for Isabelle Morrison, and what he found made his blood run cold. Chief Executive Officer of Morrison Development. Net worth in the hundreds of millions. The kind of woman who didn't accidentally end up stranded in small-town Oregon. 2 months crawled by like wounded animals. The garage struggled against rising costs and declining business as chain shops moved into the area. Caleb worked longer hours for smaller profits, watching his father's legacy slip away one unpaid invoice at a time. Harper threw herself into her studies with the desperate intensity of someone who understood that education might be their only escape route. Her acceptance into the State University's advanced mathematics program came with a price tag that made Caleb's stomach clench. $800 for tuition and materials. Money they didn't have. Money that might as well have been $8 million for all his ability to produce it. The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a lawyer who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. 30 days to vacate or pay the increased rent. $4,500 monthly, effective immediately. The mathematics of survival were simple and brutal. He couldn't earn enough to meet the new terms. Reed's Auto Repair, the business that had sustained his family for over 50 years, was about to become another casualty of progress. Harper found him staring at the legal documents that night, her homework forgotten as she processed what their future might look like. Homeless, displaced, another family sacrificed to the gods of development and profit. "Dad," she said quietly, "maybe we should consider moving to Portland. You could work for one of the big dealerships." The suggestion came from love, but it hit like a physical blow. To abandon everything his father had built. To become just another employee, punching another clock in another city that didn't know his name or care about his story. The thought made him feel like he was drowning in shallow water. But what alternatives did he have? Pride was a luxury he couldn't afford when his daughter's future hung in the balance. The mathematics of desperation had their own cruel logic, and he was running out of equations that added up to hope. Dylan Foster found him at Murphy's Bar 3 nights later, drowning his sorrows in beer that tasted like liquid defeat. His old high school friend had transformed himself from small-town dreamer into BMW dealership success story, complete with the kind of confidence that came from regular paychecks and predictable futures. "Caleb, you look like hell," Dylan observed, sliding into the booth across from him. The concern in his voice felt genuine, but it was wrapped in the kind of pity that made Caleb's teeth ache. Success stories always felt entitled to judge those still struggling with the plot twists of ordinary life. "They're closing the garage," Caleb said, the words falling flat as stones into still water. Dylan nodded as if he'd already known this was coming. In small towns, bad news traveled faster than good gossip, and everyone had opinions about other people's failures. "I heard about the rent increase. Brutal timing." His friend's sympathy felt hollow, like an echo of real emotion rather than the genuine article. "But maybe it's a blessing in disguise. You're wasting your talents in that garage. We need experienced mechanics at the dealership. $75,000 starting salary, full benefits, college fund for Harper. Real security." The offer hung between them like bait on a hook. $75,000 represented more money than Caleb had ever seen in a single year. Enough to give Harper the opportunities she deserved. Enough to silence the voice in his head that whispered about failure and inadequacy every night before sleep finally claimed him. But it also meant abandoning everything his father had worked to build, everything that connected him to his roots and his identity. The choice felt like choosing between survival and soul, between Harper's future and his own sense of self. Some decisions couldn't be undone, and he suspected this was one of them. 2 days before the eviction deadline, Isabelle Morrison returned. This time she arrived in a different vehicle entirely, a Mercedes sedan that whispered money instead of screaming it. Her timing felt deliberate, calculated to the moment when his desperation would be most acute. She found him in the garage, methodically packing tools that had belonged to his father and grandfather before him. Each wrench and socket carried the weight of generations, the accumulated wisdom of men who had worked with their hands and taken pride in honest labor. The sight of her expensive shoes on his oil-stained floor felt like a violation of sacred space. "I heard about the rent situation," she said without preamble. Her directness was both refreshing and terrifying. "I have a proposition." The word proposition, in the mouth of someone like Isabelle Morrison, could mean anything from salvation to damnation, and Caleb wasn't sure he possessed the wisdom to distinguish between them anymore. She produced a tablet from her briefcase and set it on his workbench, with the casual authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. The screen displayed architectural drawings, engineering specifications, and budget projections that made his eyes water. This wasn't about car repairs. This was about something much larger and infinitely more dangerous. "What kind of proposition?" His voice came out rougher than intended, scraped raw by weeks of stress and sleepless nights. She smiled, and the expression transformed her face into something almost human, almost approachable. But her eyes remained calculating, measuring his responses like a scientist studying data points. The kind that requires someone who understands both theoretical knowledge and practical application. Someone who went to MIT, someone who graduated summa cum laude in architecture, someone who designed the Sunset Bay resort that's still standing strong after 14 years of Oregon weather. The words hit him like physical blows, each revelation stripping away another layer of the carefully constructed anonymity he'd built around himself. His past, his education, his achievements, his carefully buried identity as something more than just a mechanic, all of it laid bare by this woman who collected information like other people collected stamps. The tablet screen showed photographs of Sunset Bay, his masterpiece of sustainable coastal architecture, the building that had launched his career and ultimately destroyed his marriage, when ambition collided with family responsibilities. The irony tasted bitter as old coffee. "I don't know what you're talking about," he lied, but his voice betrayed him with its weakness. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with the patience of a predator that knew its prey was already trapped. Caleb Reed, MIT class of 2010, graduated with highest honors. Senior thesis project became the Sunset Bay Resort. Married Rebecca Chen in 2012. Daughter Harper born 2014. Left architecture after your wife died in 2017. Opened this garage using insurance money and what remained of your savings. Each fact fell like another nail in the coffin of his carefully maintained facade. The truth hung between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Everything he'd tried to bury, every identity he'd shed, every bridge he'd burned in his retreat from the world of blueprints and building codes and client meetings that ran past midnight while his family waited at home. She knew it all. Worse, she'd known it for months, watching him and measuring him and waiting for precisely the right moment to reveal her hand. The realization made him feel naked and exposed, like standing in a spotlight while predators circled just beyond the light's edge. Why? The question emerged as barely more than a whisper. Why dig into my past? Why come here pretending to need car repairs? What do you want from me?" Her smile faded, replaced by something that might have been genuine emotion. For the first time since walking into his garage, Isabelle Morrison looked almost human, almost vulnerable. "Because I have a $200 million project that's failing. Because 3 architecture firms have walked away after producing designs that would collapse within 5 years. Because 500 families have put deposits down on homes that might kill them if I build them according to current specifications." She touched the tablet screen, bringing up new images. Aerial photographs of a coastal development site, soil analysis reports, engineering studies that painted a picture of impending disaster. The land looked beautiful from above, prime oceanfront property that would command premium prices from buyers seeking their dream homes. But the technical data told a different story. Clay soil composition that would shift with seasonal rains, elevation changes that would channel floodwater directly into foundation structures, drainage patterns that would turn the entire development into a swamp during storm season. It was a catastrophe waiting to happen, dressed up in marketing materials and architectural renderings. "The current designs are death traps," she continued, her voice carrying the weight of genuine concern. "Pretty pictures that ignore basic engineering reality. I need someone who understands that buildings have to work in the real world, not just look good in sales brochures. Someone who's spent time fixing things that break, who knows the difference between theory and practice." The compliment felt like manipulation, but the technical problems on the screen were real enough. Lives hung in the balance, families who trusted developers to build homes that would protect rather than endanger them. The moral dimension of the situation added another layer of complexity to an already impossible choice. "I stopped being an architect 7 years ago," Caleb said, though the words felt like ashes in his mouth. "I fix cars now. That's all I do." But even as he spoke, his trained eye was analyzing the site plans, identifying problems and formulating solutions with the automatic precision of old instincts that had never really died. Elevated foundations to account for seasonal flooding. Engineered drainage systems that would work with the natural water flow rather than against it. Geothermal piles driven deep enough to reach stable soil layers. His mind was already redesigning the project, and she could see it happening in real time. "Your daughter needs $800 for the university program," Isabelle said quietly. The statement felt like a knife sliding between his ribs, perfectly placed and devastatingly effective. "I could write that check right now, but that's not what this is about." She gestured around the garage, taking in the lifetime of accumulated tools and memories that would soon be scattered to the winds of foreclosure. "This is about 500 families who deserve homes that won't kill them. This is about using the gifts you've been given instead of hiding them under a mountain of misplaced guilt." The accusation stung because it carried the sharp taste of truth. He had been hiding, burying his talents under layers of self-imposed penance for crimes that existed more in his imagination than in reality. Rebecca's death had been an accident, a confluence of bad weather and worse timing that no amount of architectural genius could have prevented. But guilt was a more comfortable burden than hope, and hiding was safer than risking failure on a scale that mattered. The garage had been his monastery, his place of self-imposed exile from a world that demanded more than he felt capable of giving. "I need time to think," he said finally, though they both knew he'd already made his decision. The problems on that tablet screen were calling to parts of himself he'd thought were dead and buried. Professional pride, creative challenge, the fundamental human need to build something that mattered, something that would outlast the builder and protect the people who came after. Harper's future hung in the balance, but so did the lives of strangers who would never know his name, but would trust him with their safety every night they slept in homes he'd helped design. That night, after Harper had gone to bed clutching her acceptance letter to the advanced mathematics program, Caleb sat in his kitchen staring at coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The laptop screen displayed everything Isabelle had shown him and more, technical specifications that painted a picture of impending disaster. Soil composition reports that would make any competent engineer run screaming from the project. Foundation designs that ignored basic principles of coastal construction in favor of cost savings that would prove catastrophically expensive when the lawsuits started flying. The current architects weren't evil, just incompetent, but the end result would be the same. Families living in beautiful death traps. The choice crystallized with painful clarity. He could take Dylan's offer, abandon the garage, and disappear into the anonymous safety of employment with someone else's company. Steady paycheck. Predictable hours. No responsibility beyond showing up and following orders. It would be enough to support Harper, enough to ensure her future, enough to survive. But it would also mean letting 500 families move into homes that might collapse around them during the first major storm. The mathematics of conscience had their own brutal logic, and some equations couldn't be solved by choosing the path of least resistance. 2 weeks later, Caleb Reed stood in the conference room of Morrison Development, facing a team of engineers and architects who looked young enough to be his students. The laptop bag slung over his shoulder contained 7 years of suppressed expertise, knowledge that had been gathering dust while he played at being just another small-town mechanic. The transition back to his old world felt like putting on clothes that no longer quite fit, familiar but foreign after years of eggs. But the problems on the screens around the room were singing to him in the mathematical language of structural engineering and environmental design. "Before we begin," he said, meeting each pair of eyes in turn, "I want you to understand something. I'm not here to play politics or manage egos. I'm here because 500 families are counting on us to build homes that won't kill them. If anyone has a problem working with someone who spends his mornings fixing cars and his afternoons designing buildings, there's the door." The silence that followed felt electric, charged with the kind of tension that preceded either breakthrough or breakdown. But nobody moved toward the exit, and in their eyes he saw something he hadn't expected. Respect. Jessica Chen, the structural engineer who'd challenged him during their first meeting, leaned forward with the intensity of someone who'd found a puzzle worthy of her attention. "Show us what we're doing wrong," she said simply. The words carried the weight of genuine intellectual curiosity rather than wounded pride. Caleb opened his laptop and began dismantling their assumptions with the methodical precision of someone who understood that buildings, like cars, failed in predictable ways when fundamental principles were ignored. The room filled with the energy of minds working at full capacity, chasing solutions through the maze of engineering challenges that separated concept from reality. 6 months blurred together in a kaleidoscope of split identities and double lives. Mornings belonged to the garage, to the familiar rhythm of diagnostic work and repair procedures that kept his hands busy and his conscience clear. Mrs. Patterson's ancient Buick, Amy's college student Honda, the steady stream of neighbors and friends who trusted him with their transportation lifelines. Afternoons belonged to Morrison Development, to the intoxicating challenge of solving problems on a scale that would affect generations. The duality felt natural after the initial adjustment period, like finally using muscles that had been dormant too long. Harper flourished in her advanced mathematics program, her acceptance made possible by a scholarship that Isabelle had quietly arranged through the Morrison Foundation. The 10-year-old attacked calculus problems with the same methodical precision her father brought to engine diagnostics, finding patterns and solutions that spoke to inherited gifts for logical thinking. "Dad," she said one evening, looking up from homework that would challenge college sophomores, "I think I want to study engineering, like what you're doing with the houses, but maybe for bridges or spacecraft." The pride that swelled in his chest felt almost painful in its intensity. The Riverview development took shape on paper first, then in computer models that tested every assumption against the harsh realities of Oregon coastal weather. Caleb's foundation design looked expensive on spreadsheets, but would save millions in litigation costs when the inevitable storms arrived. Elevated construction that worked with seasonal flooding rather than against it. Drainage systems that mimicked natural water flow patterns. Materials chosen for longevity rather than initial cost savings. It was architecture with the hard-won wisdom of someone who'd spent years fixing things that broke because they weren't built properly in the first place. The city council presentation went better than anyone had dared hope. Council members who'd expected another glossy sales pitch found themselves facing technical specifications that addressed their deepest concerns about coastal development. Caleb's dual identity as mechanic and architect gave him credibility that pure academics couldn't match. He understood how things failed in the real world, and his designs reflected that understanding. When Councilwoman Rodriguez asked about his qualifications, his answer was simple. I've spent 14 years building things that last, and 7 years fixing things that don't. The groundbreaking ceremony for Phase 1 took place on a crisp October morning that painted the coastal landscape in shades of gold and crimson. Caleb stood next to Isabelle, wearing a hard hat that felt foreign after months of splitting time between garage coveralls and architect's business casual. The first shovel of earth marked more than the beginning of construction. It represented the resurrection of dreams he'd thought were dead and buried with his wife. Harper stood nearby, beaming with pride at her father's return to the profession that had always been his true calling, despite the detours and diversions that life had imposed. But success in the present couldn't erase the ghosts of the past. That evening, as the celebration wound down and the last of the local dignitaries headed home, Caleb found himself standing alone in the garage that had been his refuge for 7 years. The tools still hung in their familiar places. The smell of motor oil and honest work still permeated every surface. This space had saved his sanity during the darkest period of his life, providing purpose and identity when everything else had crumbled. Now it felt like a bridge between his old life and his new one, a reminder that growth didn't require abandoning everything that had come before. 2 years later, the first families moved into Riverview Phase 1. Caleb walked through the development on a Saturday morning, Harper beside him, with a clipboard full of calculations she'd done to verify his stress load distributions. The houses stood solid and welcoming against the coastal backdrop, their elevated foundations and engineered drainage systems invisible to casual observers, but absolutely critical to long-term survival. Mrs. Patterson's sister had purchased Unit 47, a wheelchair-accessible home with ocean views and the kind of thoughtful details that came from architects who understood real human needs rather than just aesthetic preferences. "Dad?" Harper said, now 12 years old and tall enough to reach his shoulder. "I calculated the safety margins for these foundations. They could withstand a Category 3 hurricane without structural damage." Her voice carried the satisfaction of someone who understood that mathematics weren't abstract concepts, but tools for protecting people from the chaos of natural forces. Caleb ruffled her hair, marveling at the brilliant young woman she was becoming. Rebecca would have been proud of both of them, he realized. Proud of his decision to stop hiding from his gifts and start using them to make the world a little safer for families like theirs had been. The garage still operated every morning, now with additional staff and expanded services. Word had spread that Reed's Auto Repair was owned by the architect who'd designed Riverview, and that reputation brought new customers seeking the kind of careful attention to detail that prevented problems rather than just fixing them after they occurred. The business had become something unique, a place where theoretical knowledge merged with practical experience, where engineering principles informed even the most routine repair procedures. College students studying mechanical engineering came to learn from someone who understood both sides of the equation. Evenings found the family in their expanded kitchen, Harper working through advanced placement physics, while Caleb reviewed blueprints for Phase 2 of the Riverview development. The conversation flowed seamlessly between homework help and professional consultation, as his daughter's natural mathematical gifts proved invaluable for checking calculations and spotting potential problems. "This beam specification looks wrong," she'd observe, pointing to a structural detail that had indeed been miscalculated by the junior architects. Her eye for patterns and precision had inherited the best of both parents. Isabelle Morrison had become more than a business partner. She'd evolved into something approaching genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared commitment to excellence. Their professional relationship had weathered the inevitable conflicts that arose when perfectionist personalities collided over technical details and budget constraints. But they'd learned to argue productively, channeling their disagreements into better solutions rather than personal animosity. "You're still the most stubborn architect I've ever worked with," she told him during one particularly heated debate about window specifications. "Good," he replied. "Stubborn keeps buildings standing when cutting corners would let them fall down." The success of Riverview had attracted attention from other developers seeking architects who understood both the technical and practical aspects of coastal construction. Job offers arrived regularly, some with salaries that would have solved every financial problem Caleb had ever faced. But he'd learned something important during his years of in the garage. Money couldn't buy the satisfaction that came from work that mattered, and prestige couldn't replace the deep contentment of solving problems that improved people's lives. He turned down the offers and continued splitting his time between morning repairs and afternoon designs. Harper's acceptance to MIT arrived on a spring morning that felt heavy with symbolism. The same university where her father had learned the theoretical foundations that he'd spent years learning to apply in the real world. The same institution that had launched his career, and indirectly led to the circumstances that had derailed it when family responsibilities collided with professional ambitions. But Harper represented a new generation, one that had grown up understanding that success meant more than just climbing ladders or accumulating credentials. She wanted to study structural engineering with a focus on disaster-resistant design, carrying forward her father's commitment to building things that protected people rather than just impressing them. The day she graduated high school, Harper delivered the valedictorian speech to a gymnasium packed with families who lived in homes her father had helped design. Her words about the importance of education that served community needs rather than just individual advancement drew sustained applause from an audience that understood the difference between knowledge pursued for its own sake and wisdom applied to solve real problems. Caleb watched from the front row, remembering the scared 10-year-old who'd asked if they could afford her math program tuition. Time had a way of transforming impossibilities into inevitabilities when people refused to give up on their dreams. That evening, as the celebration wound down and Harper prepared for her summer internship at Morrison Development, Caleb walked through the garage one more time. The space had evolved over the years, expanding to accommodate both automotive repair services and the growing architectural consulting business. Young engineers worked alongside experienced mechanics, learning that theoretical knowledge meant nothing without practical application. The walls displayed framed photographs of completed projects alongside automotive repair certifications, visual reminders that competence came in many forms and true expertise required understanding how things worked in the real world. The future stretched ahead like an uncharted highway, full of possibilities that seemed impossible just a few years earlier. Phase 2 of Riverview was under construction, incorporating lessons learned from Phase 1 and pushing the boundaries of sustainable coastal development even further. Harper would spend 4 years at MIT learning the theoretical foundations that would support her practical experience, then return to Cedar Falls as a structural engineer, capable of designing buildings that could withstand whatever natural disasters climate change might deliver. The cycle was completing itself, knowledge passing from one generation to the next, but enriched by experience and tempered by wisdom. As Caleb locked the garage doors and headed home to his daughter and their modest house, filled with architectural drawings and calculus homework, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this point. 7 years of self-imposed exile had felt like punishment at the time, but those years had taught him things that no university could provide. How to work with his hands, how to solve problems with limited resources, how to understand failure from the inside out. Most importantly, how to integrate all aspects of himself into something stronger and more complete than any single identity could provide. The mockery of those businessmen at Murphy's Bar seemed like ancient history now, their assumptions and prejudices as irrelevant as last year's weather reports. They'd seen only surface details and drawn conclusions that revealed more about their own limitations than about the man they'd chosen to belittle. Success, Caleb had learned, wasn't about proving other people wrong or collecting external validation. It was about using whatever gifts you'd been given to make the world a little better, a little safer, a little more hopeful for the people who came after you. And sometimes, just sometimes, that was enough to transform both the world and the person doing the transforming.